Oh,
Holy
holy sh.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the relaunch of our channel. We have a bunch of fun videos that I plan on posting all throughout the rest of this year, and the very first one is one that I am pretty sure all of y'all are going to enjoy. So you know that I've been working on Princess Bubblegum for about 2 years or so now, and I just keep adding more and more and more and more stuff, and at some point I said to myself, make a candy sword. But I don't just want it to be painted in little stripes to look like something peppermint. I want it to look really, really realistic, as though this thing is actually made out of edible candy. And so that has been a really kind of tricky process, but I'm making this video so that you guys can kind of see my thought process behind it, how I ended up making it, and the fact that it actually turned out really good. Scone was like not expecting this whatsoever. She was a non-believer until the moment when I demolded the thing. So stay tuned and we will get started on this completely nutty process. So when I first started planning this sword, I knew that I really wanted to cast it in a resin in order to get that really amazing transparent look. You can get some really great shiny effects from paint and an airbrush, but in terms of transparency, that really kind of comes through when the thing is actually translucent through all the layers. For me, that is always going to mean a pour in 2-part resin. But in this case, I want something clear. So that's going to mean the Smooth Cast 300 series. They make a couple of these. They're all 2-part, easy to mix. You mix them 1-to-1. You always want to make sure that you're in a well-ventilated area though. You know, they are like any kind of chemical that you're going to use, so you always need to take the right safety precautions. So if we've got a clear material, that's not quite enough. We want it a transparent material, but something that you can still see through while it has a little bit of color. And so the key to that is you add a little bit of dye. In my case, I used 2 different dyes. I added a So Strong red and I added a, oh no, it's got white. Oh no! Oh, it's leaking a little bit. I have it on my hand. But when you add these pigments to your resin, you end up with something that is still transparent, but wonderful and colored, and you can see through it, and it just really looks like candy in my opinion. So knew that I wanted to do that. Easy, done a lot of resin before. What I've not done is done crazy stripes like this. There are ways to cast stripes in your resin, and usually what that involves is you lay down a bottom layer of one color, allow it to partially cure so that it's still a little tacky, but it's solid enough that the edge of that stripe isn't going to change. You then pour your next color on top of it, it bonds to the layer underneath and creates a really strong resin object as though it was just made from one single casting pour. You keep doing this until you're done with all of your stripes, allow it to fully cure, and you've got a striped object. But what do you do when you want the stripes on the side? That's kind of the problem here. How do you get that, number 1, at an angle? And then number 2, into a really long object like a sword. Like I thought a lot about this over time. I was thinking to myself, how would Vulpin make this? How would Vulpin do this insane object? And I don't think I came up with exactly what the right way is to do it, but I definitely came up with a way that was a bit more user-friendly for me, an amateur who doesn't have a full shop of equipment, and also something that I felt really confident might work. So here's my thought. You want a striped candy cane sword, but you want those stripes not horizontal to the ground, but at about a 30-degree angle. So my idea is we cast the sword, but we include a little bump out area at about that 30-degree angle so that we can tilt the whole thing at a slight angle to the ground and let gravity settle the stripes down. When we pour that resin in, it's going to fall to the bottom of the mold, build up until it reaches the top on that angle because of the angle that we've tilted the sword, stop, let it cure for about 40 minutes, and then pour the next stripe in. I ended up getting Smooth Cast 375 for this. It was actually a happy accident. They were out of the other ones, and so I got the really long set one. But the advantage of that is that the pot time is still really low, but the cure time is really long. So I actually have a lot of time in between each stripe to mix and change things and do other stuff. The downside of that is it was an 18-hour process to pour 13 pieces of this monster of a mold. It was starting at 8 a.m. I woke up, I was like, it's time. I went and I did it, and I didn't finish until midnight, which I think is 14 hours, not 18 hours, but still. Whew, not knowing if your entire cast was garbage for that long and then until the morning as you had to wait for the whole thing to cure, do not recommend. Maybe try doing a smaller project the first time. This is not a lesson that I've learned in my life yet, but this is my advice unto all of you. Do a test. To start, I actually didn't sculpt the base of the sword. Instead, I decided that this project was so complex and so difficult that I should just make life easier for myself and start with a foam sword that I found from a Halloween store. You know, a lot of times people kind of say, oh, you should make everything. You know, if you're a cosplayer, you shouldn't buy any part of your cosplay. And I call nonsense on that, because if something works just as well for you and makes your life easier, why not? Why not? I did not want to spend a whole bunch of time carving and creating a sword like this just for a flat part of the blade. No, that's not the most interesting part of this project. Instead, I took this guy and then built straight on top of it using my sulfur-free clay. This stuff is really cool. I highly recommend grabbing a little bit of it if you want to do any kind of sculpting in the future. The thing about sulfur-free clay is it's a little different from wet clay and very different from something like Sculpting or an air dry clay. The main characteristic of this is that because it's sulfur-free, it never dries out. So you can leave it out in the open. You can leave your sculpt for months and months at a time if you're just like, I can't look at it anymore, I have to go do something else, and then come back to it, and it won't be dried out. It's really hard though until you kind of warm it up. Once it becomes warm, it becomes much, much softer and stickier and more easily usable for sculpting, or in my case, using these really cool little filigree molds to make my little fun filigrees, just like I did for Bubblegum's chess piece. This is actually the reason why I keep this in an old crock pot. When it's time for me to use the clay, I plug it in and it warms it up so that it's at a usable temperature without me having to take all the time to knead the clay over and over again. You don't have to do this, but this mold is so big and uses so much silicone that I always save our old silicone casts, because silicone sticks to silicone, no matter if it's cured or not. So if you have an old mold, you can just cut it apart with a box knife or scissors, dump it into your new mold, and as long as it's not touching your actual object that you're casting, it'll just fill up that space and you don't have to use any brand new material. I use so many mold pieces in this, and I'm really glad I did. It's definitely like a good gallon or so of silicone that I saved. So for this sword, because it's nice and flat, not a lot of cut curves, a very obvious centerline seam, we're gonna make a two-part mold, which means we've got one mold piece on the bottom, one on the top, and they are separated so they can come apart and we can remove our object and put resin in that middle area. I do have a confession, this is technically not the right way to make a two-part box mold. What you're really supposed to do is fill the bottom up with clay, mold the top, flip the whole thing, and then fill up the bottom of the mold. This makes a really clean middle line. You can put your keys in there very easily. In my case though, we lost our wet clay in the move, and so I didn't have any. Also, this mold is monstrous, and I kind of really didn't want to deal with putting all of the wet clay all around those little handle filigrees, which would have been a huge pain. So I'm cheating a little bit, but you know what? It's cosplay. It's fine, I don't mind. However, because I'm cheating, when you make this mold, you have to be especially certain that your object is parallel to the ground. And so that's why I am measuring all over the place to make sure that this sword is exactly even and parallel. So when I pour in my silicone, it's gonna go right up to that sword edge all along the entire piece. Popping in my recycled silicone here, and now it's time to fill in the gaps with my new stuff. This is Smooth-On's Rebound 25, and like resin, it comes in a two-part. You have A and you have B, and when you mix them together, you get something that cures into silicone. Technically, this is used for brush-on molds, but you can use it for other stuff as long as you're very careful and make sure you remove any kind of bubbles and don't create any weird crevices with it, because it's a little thicker than something like Mold Star. In this case, I'm living real dangerously and pouring directly out of my big bucket like a fool. I don't know why I thought I could do this. I guess it worked pretty well with very, very minimal spillage, but normally I'm like way too paranoid to do that and like to just dip in a cup and pour it out otherwise. You really don't want to get the unmixed stuff all over your area, so putting down a tarp, using gloves. Oh, actually, speaking of gloves, there's a specific kind of glove that you definitely want to use. There's lots of different brands of materials that you can use during casting. The type of gloves you need to use, however, are some kind of vinyl, latex-free glove. Do not use latex in your casting. It will inhibit the cure process and you will get something that will not cure. I learned this the very hard way. So once your part A is in, it's time to pour part B in. Actually, I think I did this reversed. And then it is time to mix them up really, really well. This is very important. Anything that is unmixed will be uncured and you do not want that. The downside to thoroughly mixing is you're going to introduce even more bubbles into the material, and anyone who has casted before knows you really do not want bubbles butted up against your cast. Fortunately, there's an easy solution, and that is to use a vacuum chamber. What this does is it creates a vacuum inside of the pot which forces any trapped air inside of the silicone out in order to equalize everything. This means that you end up with a mostly bubble-free silicone, which will help with the casting process. This is actually even more important to do with your resin if you can. If you have ever cast resin and you hold it up to the light and you see a bunch of bubbles inside of it, that's because this material comes with a lot of air in it. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. And so you need to use something like a vacuum chamber, or if it's a small piece, a pressure pot will force that air out or crush that air down. And so then you end up with a nice, almost crystal clear casting. This is less important if you're doing something like cold casting or you're going to paint on top of it because, who's going to see the air trapped in the middle? But for something like a transparent candy cane sword, bubble-free resin is super important. And so every single layer I casted of this, I put it through the vacuum chamber as well. So here we go, just starting it off, pouring that very first layer, filling in all of the little gaps with our pre-cured silicone, and then you just keep going into infinity. So we've got the basic sword mold going, but how are we gonna make all of these completely insane stripes onto the sword? If I was to pour in the silicone, even when it's tilted from the very top of the hilt, that's gonna make a weird slippy slide of colored resin going down the bottom, and I don't want that. I instead need to somehow get each stripe of resin all the way down into the bottom of the sword without it touching any of the upper part of the sword. I temporarily thought about using one of those super big fat pixie stick straw things and kind of piping it in like a slide, but I ended up coming up with something that's a little less insane. The idea here is that I have a template for exactly where I want each of those stripes. And so instead of having one pour spout all the way at the top of the hilt, why not just make a pour spout at the top of each of those stripes? That way I can just pour a little bit of resin directly into the spout. Once I see the resin bubble up to the top of the spout, I know that's time to stop, and then I can let it cure, move on to spout number 2. So to create those hollow spouts, I used a little bit more of my sulfur-free clay and kind of just stuck it onto the side so that it was touching the sword. And that lines up perfectly well with my template. With the mold halfway done, I've added in my registration keys, which if you've not heard of keys before, you always need these in a 2-part mold. Essentially, it's what helps the whole thing line up and lock together. If you just have 2 flat pieces of silicone, it's gonna slip and slide all over the place. So having something sticking up or sticking down into the other piece really helps make sure that you've aligned everything. In this case, this is just more cut cured silicone that I stuck in there. And then it's time for more cut silicone and the second half. Put these all over the mold and then spray very liberally with mold release. I had actually done this for the inside sword portion as well, but it is super vital, so important that you put some kind of mold release on top of the first part of your 2-part mold. You just need to make sure that the top half of your silicone does not bond to the bottom half, because if it does, you don't have a 2-part mold anymore. And then y'all know how this goes. It's time to just pour in the top half of the mold, and once it is fully cured, voila! We have this really great looking mold of my bubblegum sword. All that detail is preserved. It turned out really well. I'm very happy with it. And thanks to the keys, it lines up really well. However, it is so huge, it weighs so much, and it's so floppy. And so it really needs a little bit of extra security in order to make sure that it remains nice and straight so that we have a nice straight sword. these are some pieces of wood that Scone cut out for me to match the shape of my mold. And we just kind of place one on the top, one on the bottom. And then I actually use a bunch of clamps in order to really securely hold that mold in shape. They're really strong and really tight, and it's going to guarantee that whatever you want to stay kind of locked together is going to stay really, really tight. No leakage, no moving, no nothing. And here she is, all clamped and done and propped up on her side. I'm really glad I ended up adding that extra little bump out at the 30-degree angle, because without that, I feel like propping it up on a corner would have sucked. And in this case, I'm sure that it's really, really stable. And then moment of truth, the pouring of each of the layers into each of these little spouts. I'm gonna alternate red and white all the way down. You can kind of see a little bit of the resin poking out. Sad confession, I took zero video of the resin pouring process because it was just such an absolute like fiasco to be doing. Not fiasco, it was more just like very, you have to, every 40 minutes, time to pour the new thing, and then you put it in the vacuum chamber for 3 minutes exactly, and then you take it out, and then you do the next one, and then you mix it up, 40 minutes, blah, 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 blah. It was a process, and a lot of this process honestly was kind of sticking to my schedule, and I felt like it was more important to make sure that all of the layers cast correctly than to kind of film the entire process. So I hope you guys forgive me and that this video makes it a little clear what I was doing. Essentially, we've got 12 layers going all throughout the sword, and then one 13th layer all the way up at the very top in order to cast the handle. The cure time for Smoothcast 327 is 2 to 4 hours, and so I poured each new layer about 40 to 50 minutes into that cure time in order for it to partially set and harden, but not be so fully cured that it wouldn't really tightly bond to the next layer. I also had a little bit of extra resin in my cups when I was in the process of pouring, and so one way that I would kind of check throughout the process is I would touch it with a little bit of a popsicle stick, and if it felt tacky but not wet, then I knew that it was probably about time to pour the next stripe. Now, bear in mind, resin is really temperamental, and so that was kind of the one big fear shirt about making this sword, is the fact that you can't actually see if it succeeded until you open the thing. So, I'm gonna do it.
Moment of truth.
I'm gonna do it.
Pray for us.
Anticipating some mess up, but let's see. I hope the stripes are correct. Pray for me. Oh, holy sh.
That looks so much better than I thought it was going to.
You doubted me?
Yeah, I did.
Holy shit, the whole thing is intact. It's a little darker than I'd like, but I think it's pretty good.
I think if you hold it up to the sun too.
Wow. After popping off the resin pour spouts and adding a little bit of quick gold leaf for a photo shoot that I had very last minute, the sword was pretty much complete. I think that this looks so cool, y'all. I am very happy that I went with this method. The kind of transparency throughout it is like just so obvious, but it is so smooth and even, and these stripes are really amazing no matter what angle you look at it. And I think that once I can clean up a little bit of the edging here and any of the very minor imperfections, it's gonna be such a really cool piece, especially outside. It is such a great final piece to my Princess Bubblegum iconography dress, and I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. We actually have a whole lot of content coming for this channel as well, so I know that we are kind of fighting to get back up on top of the YouTube algorithm from having to take a break. So if you guys want to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and honestly, sharing this with your friends really helps us out so much. We have a lot of really fun content coming for the rest of the year, including a secret project, Beauty and the Beast wedding jackets, our how we made Miss Frizzle walkthrough, how we made Princess Kenny, how we made this craft room actually is one that I have coming as well, and I hope I see you guys there.